I appreciate your interest and I hope we can generate some dialogue and some questions at the end. You know, I was drafted in '67. I was in the Army, and I really felt that it wasn't the right thing for me to do. But I lasted my 2 years and got out and raised a family. And I'm also a part of San Diego 350.org. And so I'm involved with the environment locally here as well with the actions that we take. But I'm also a grandparent, a parent and a grandparent. And I'm really convinced that it's up to us. We have to do better at leaving this place when we leave. And it became apparent to me in talking with my San Diego 350 climate activists that I'd have to say they had an underappreciation, if you will, of the military's impact on the climate crisis. They were aware of what the military wanted to do in response to it, as far as rising sea level and what they were going to do with Norfolk and San Diego and all of those ships and what's going to happen when Miami Beach goes underwater and everything. But they really didn't have an appreciation of how much the military contributes. So I want to take a few moments of your time and talk about the military's impact on greenhouse gases and pollution, and also how much of our tax dollars the military spends and what we might do with that more effectively. So typically, if we were to present this to a climate activist group, we'd spend a little time going over what Veterans for Peace does. I just shortly say that we feel that violence should be the last resort of how humans resolve conflicts among each other, and leave it at that. But I feel that this slide really captures the essence of the threat that climate change and U.S. militarism bring together for the human condition. On the left, of course, we see Greta Thunberg, and she talks and reminds us that we are indeed in a crisis. Our house is on fire. We need to react. And I noticed that there are a few of you in the audience who have gray hair like me, and you might remember President Eisenhower, the ex-general. He was a two-term president, but he warned us back in the 50s about the dangers that lie behind relying too much on a military industrial complex. And what he says is every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some facts. And I'd like to point out that virtually everything that we refer to in this program can be found at our website, VFP.org climate crisis. And we can drop that into the chat later, or Barry can write it on the board for those of you in the hall there. But it's amazing when you think about the fact that the U.S. military is the largest single institutional user of fossil fuels, and hence it is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases, of carbon dioxide. And that's a fact that climate activists rarely look at. This is one entity, and so let's take a peek at it. Let's not keep it wrapped in secrecy like the military would like you to think it is. In fact, we point out that the U.S. government and military has actively been trying to obscure the accurate accounting of the pollution that the military inflicts upon our environment. This goes back to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which came out of a meeting of climate scientists of many of the nations of the world back in 1997. But the US was instrumental in having many of its military or any country's military emissions being counted. And even though the US never signed onto the Kyoto Protocol, that exemption passed. And this was for all countries in the world. So there was never a drive to accurately record and account for military emissions. Well, the Paris Accords of 2015 weren't much better. They left the military emissions up to the individual countries. It was voluntary. So we really don't hear much about it. So when we talk about a fact such as the B-52 using as much fuel in an hour as the average car driver uses in 7 years, it comes from a series of estimations and some reporting. And this actually is from the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. We draw on this type of information as well as from Brown University and other investigators. And of course, if jet fuel is the single largest component of greenhouse gases, the US has the world's largest military aircraft fleet. We have about 13,000 in our aircraft fleet. The rest of the world has about 15,000 in total. In fact, if the US military was a single country, it would rank as number 47 among the 175 countries or so that report in the world of greenhouse gas emissions. Number 47. This is just from calculating emissions from fuel usage. So that's one single entity. And again, these figures are estimates since the military does not provide complete values for their emissions. Now in San Diego, we see it virtually every year. We had a break for 2 years because of COVID, but the Blue Angels come. And the question this year that we're posing is this practice, entertainment, or pollution? I mean, this is a matter of choice that they come here. Each time they fly, it uses about 9,000 gallons of jet fuel each hour. That would produce the equivalent of carbon dioxide that's produced by a car being driven about 150,000 miles. So I guess, this would be something for us to think about when we see a flyover at a sports event. And of course, accurately accounting for military emissions is really a difficult task. We've got military R&D, we've got production of weapons, we've got weapons testing, troop training, we've got wars, conventional wars, drones, weapons sales, arms races, war games, military contractors. And then at the end of any type of conflict or war, you've got cleanup and reconstruction. And certainly, if the reconstruction involves a lot of concrete, you're talking additional greenhouse gases that are put out into the atmosphere. Now, with the US finally ending the 20 plus years of war in Afghanistan, one would think that we might see some type of reduction in military emissions and military spending, but it really seems like we've immediately gone into seeing a lot of increased noise directed at both China and Russia. Now, on the left, you see war games that are conducted in the Pacific. They routinely involve the US, British, Australian navies. There are regular exercises, if you call them exercises, with South Korea and Japan. And of course, if we look at Europe, which we'll address in a couple of more slides as well, NATO had virtually surrounded Russia with a ring of ballistic missiles in spite of prior promises to refrain from such provocative actions. And again, military exercises are conducted on a routine basis. And as part of that, the US maintains approximately, and this is really to me an astounding number, approximately 750 bases in over 80 countries internationally. These bases range in size from very small lily pads that typically provide pre-positioned weaponry and supplies to huge complexes that include hospitals, bowling alleys, golf courses, their own power plants. And some of you who are veterans have experienced some of that. They're very extensive. This, incidentally, is from the book Base Nation by David Vine. Think about the supply lines it takes, the fossil fuels, to maintain these bases. You can see there's many of them clustered throughout the Middle East, which provides protection for the fossil fuel industry. You also see them in Asia and Europe. So at the end of the day, the military, in supporting these international bases, also maintains a fleet of vehicles that totals nearly 200,000. And this includes, for example, 75,000 Humvees, which typically get 4 to 6 miles per gallon. And except for approximately 80 or so nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers, the entire military fleet runs on oil. And of course, we have the latest branch of US military service called the United States Space Force, and it also involves a heavy carbon load for its computers, rockets, and other devices that they launch. So we know that there is no such thing as a green war. The effects of war and preparation for war are polluting and long-lasting. And we know that even in the Ukraine, which is from the picture on the left there, the buildup, the short-term and the long-term impacts from the fighting are generating extreme amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, and reconstruction, which will come eventually, will be a further and significant carbon cost made necessary by the conflict. We know from experience that even 50 years after the Vietnam War, children there are still maimed by unexploded ordnance or born with severe birth defects from the transgenerational impact of Agent Orange. I mean, even here in San Diego, we raised our kids in a suburb, and it was adjacent to a fenced-off area. Well, it happened to be that the fenced-off area was an old World War II Army base called Camp Elliott, and it was fenced off because of unexploded ordnance. And of course, 2, 8, and 10-year-olds decided to go exploring and lost their lives because of the unexploded ordnance. That's even in our own country. On the right, you see a picture of a burn pit. That's an open site of solid waste incineration, and who knows what chemicals are in there. They've been the subject of lawsuits by veterans and civilians alike. Something in the news that is pretty alarming to me, since we have several military air bases nearby, but forever chemicals, PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, they're a group of man-made chemicals first synthesized by DuPont for Teflon coating on pans, and it seems to be ubiquitous in many other consumer products, such as waterproofing boots and clothing. It's even in dental floss and makeup, but it can cause reproductive damage and other cancers. A primary use, though, of PFAS, which concerns us at Veterans for Peace, is that PFAS are widely used in firefighting foam to put out jet fueled fires at airports and specifically military air bases. And there are many bases throughout the country where that water has been polluted because of the runoff of these PFAS chemicals. In fact, the Biden administration's EPA is set to reclassify two of the most common PFAS compounds as hazardous chemicals and make them subject to Superfund status for cleanup. This is residue from military airfields and training exercises. And of course, we can't forget if nuclear weapons are ever used. I mean, there's still probably 12,000 in the world, but uranium mining and processing and production of nuclear weapons all have tremendous carbon footprints, even without exploding them. So there's a host of activities and substances that the military is involved with. And we at the Climate Crisis and Militarism Group feel that we need accurate accountability of all of this. We're being asked as citizens to make some tough decisions when it comes to the climate crisis. And we feel that our military should be acting in a responsible fashion as well. There is some activity, I'm pleased to say, although it's really not enough. The Army has put forth a climate strategy which is aimed at reducing the military's carbon footprint by some. Their plan, though, is to be net zero in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. They want to develop electrical tactical vehicles, and they want to look at their procurement process as well. So these are steps in the right direction, but the 2050 timeline really seems like it should be accelerated a whole lot. We feel that reducing the footprint goes way beyond solar panels on infantrymen's backpacks and experimental biodiesel for some naval vessels. And in fact, in the Army's report, they do not cloak it in an attitude of true climate mitigation, but they want to be able to more effectively accomplish their mission, which is to win wars. Now, the current war in Ukraine, aside from the mere travesty of the invasion by Putin's Russia on Ukraine, is having a severe impact on our environment as well. It's really just more of the same. And what we're seeing is increased military spending, increased usage of armaments, and this is creating increased emissions. Even United States climate envoy John Kerry said that the Ukraine war hinders any united effort to try to deal with the climate challenge. The current conflict magnifies the environmental and climate impacts of war in preparation for war. And as all of these countries ramp up their military spending, we see that this new arms race really is in direct conflict with any type of climate goal to keep the temperature rise under 1.5 degrees centigrade. So we've got a catastrophe awaiting us at the same time. As Greta says, this is code red for humanity. This slide is just a reminder that the goals are to have emissions peak by 2025. And you can see from this graph, it's a little busy, but we're still on an uptick here when we need to be ratcheting these down. Now, this topic, averting climate catastrophe, no new arms race, is actually a national webinar that Veterans for Peace is putting on Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern time, and that can also be accessed through our website. So we've looked at how the military pollutes. Let's look at how it spends and what it spends on money. Now, this slide may be a little difficult to read, but the lead table here with all the action and all the food and the waiters is a gentleman wearing a war outfit. So he's at a banquet table, and what we see in the back are healthcare, sciences, arts, education, all being starved for funding. And we know that the U.S. has spent nearly $16 trillion on war in the past 2 decades. Now, at Veterans for Peace, we don't have an issue with soldiers and sailors. We have issues with politicians who spend this money and make the policies. And looking at this amount of money, instead of funding endless wars, there are a variety of activities that probably you can think of a couple of them. Maybe decarbonize the U.S. electric grid, provide COVID vaccines for low-income countries, erase student debt. I don't know. There are a lot of opportunities to spend money. I mean, we look at the discretionary budget for fiscal year 2022, and although President Biden did spend more money on non-military items in the budget, he actually increased the military budget over what Trump had. And this number of 765 was even increased further by Congress. And the graph is a little busy, but the big blue part of the pie represents the military. But that's not even the total military, because many items that you think should be in the Department of Defense budget are omitted. For example, nuclear weapons, that's actually a line item in the energy column. Don't forget veterans benefits, Homeland Security, border enforcement, the intelligence agencies, and of course the massive annual interest payment that's due on the military's portion of the national debt. Totaled up, the amount spent easily surpasses $1.25 trillion. In both parties, both major political parties routinely approve the National Defense Authorization Act with very little discussion. And we know that in that the contractors, the military contractors, have done a superb job of making their defense business a jobs issue, in that they put jobs to produce, say, the F-35 or a tank or some type of ship in many congressional districts. So cutting the military budget or redirecting the military budget seems to be something that they are hesitant to talk about. But we feel we do need to talk about it, and we do need to hold the Defense Department, the Pentagon, we need to hold them accountable. We're not saying we need to get rid of it, but we're saying let's hold them accountable. It's our tax money, and it's a matter of priorities. So when we look and dive deeper, we spend $81 billion a year guarding the world's oil supply. One contractor itself, Lockheed Martin, received $75 billion. And it seems that whenever there's some type of crisis that in their mind demands a military response, they can always find the money for that. But it's difficult to find money for schools, for kids, for healthcare. And who benefits? Well, for example, the Big Five CEO, the chief executive officers of the biggest five contractors, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, their average compensation was $22 million for one person. And this is for something in the defense industry. And just, as an example, a Stinger anti-aircraft missile, we've heard a lot about those from Ukraine. Well, they're 38,000 apiece. The Javelin anti-tank missile, 78,000 apiece. So, the U.S. is supplying it. The Biden administration has already committed to providing $3.2 billion in military aid, but the contractors are getting rich off of it. Now, just briefly, there is an issue. There's an organization called the International Organization on Immigration. Well, they estimate that by 2050, there will be anywhere from 200 million to 1 billion climate refugees due to the climate crisis. And we see the developing countries' responses, such as USA, China, Russia, the European Union. Well, they're actually erecting border walls to keep out refugees. And as an example, what this chart demonstrates is that merely we have spent significantly more money on militarization projects at the border than on actual climate financing. And a quote that I'd like to share with you is from an investigative journalist called Christian Parenti. And he says, "The US government is dead serious about climate change, but not in the way you might think. While carbon taxes and green grids remain decidedly out of reach on Capitol Hill, planners at the Pentagon have been quietly preparing to take charge of a planet shaken by climate chaos." And Christian Parenti refers to plans like these as the politics of the armed lifeboat. So we look at how much money is spent on the military. It's more than the next 11 countries combined. There are others besides Veterans for Peace that are calling for a better accountability and a redirection of some of this money. In fact, the Poor People's Moral Budget, they're asking for a $350 billion reduction. And in their analysis, they looked at it, and their point of view is that with specific targets, reducing the Pentagon spending can be done without affecting the so-called security of the United States. And one of the things that we hear, an argument that we hear, is that the defense sector provides good paying jobs Well, as part of the analysis and looking at a just transition to a greener economy, this is something that was done from um, Brown University and the Cost of War Project. Essentially, what they're saying is that for every $1 million that are invested in creating jobs, say in the defense industry, we could actually get a much higher return on our investment in those jobs for people if those jobs were in healthcare, if they were in infrastructure or education, rather than merely in the defense sector. Now, I've given you some really kind of some heavy data, but I feel that it provides good background. People in their local communities are doing good things at local levels, but we can't lose sight of the biggest polluter that we have in the world, the single biggest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases. So we've been successful with Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She has introduced a House resolution to require accountability of all military emissions with an eye towards reducing those emissions so that we can meet those climate goals of limiting the temperature rise. We have created a robust website, veteransforpeace.org, Take Action Climate Crisis. I'll show you a screenshot next, but we've made it easy for you to talk and send a note to your congressperson to become a co-sponsor of House Resolution 767. You merely click and put in your zip code, and it will personalize a letter for you. Now, I checked, and there are 32 co-sponsors in the House on this bill, but none are from your area. Now, Barry, at this point, you probably should pull out some bumper stickers. I can't see you. I hope you're doing that. But that's
all up, Gary. I'm all up. You
you've also given this slideshow presentation to about 60 groups. And one of the things we ask of you is if you see value in spreading this knowledge, can you find an opportunity for us? We have about 8 people who are trained to deliver this presentation, and we have given it to other Veterans for Peace groups. We've given it to local climate groups such as Sunrise Movement, 350.org. We've done peace action groups, and we've done local sustainability groups and social justice groups affiliated with churches. So we would ask you to help us line up a presentation. All you would do is give us the contact. We also meet with congressional representatives and do media outreach. Now, this is a screenshot of our webpage. On the upper left, you see the tab to support House Resolution 767. There are robust resources under downloadable resources. We provide an opportunity for you to schedule a presentation or to get more information by clicking on this button. And we've also included some various videos to back up the information that we've given you here. There's Barry's bumper stickers. On the left, there's an informational trifold brochure. I've personally printed up a couple hundred to take to Earth Day this Sunday for me. I hope to generate a lot of conversation with them. We're all in this together. We need your help. I hope I've provided you some food for thought. Thank you for your attention.